The night Cassidy found out, she was standing in the kitchen of a house that wasn't hers anymore. Not really, pouring herself a glass of water she didn't actually want, listening to her husband laugh on the other side of the wall. It wasn't a laugh she recognized. Low, easy, unhurried. The kind of laugh a man lets out when he's completely sure no one important is listening. She stayed very still. His voice dropped into French. Not the careful, schoolbook French he used at his firm's Montreal events when he wanted to impress clients. This was something looser, more intimate. The French he'd grown up speaking with his mother in Chicoutimi before money and ambition had scrubbed most of it away. Cassidy had always loved that he still had it somewhere inside him. She had spent 3 years quietly studying it so she could understand that part of him. She had never told him. It was something she'd wanted to give him as a surprise, when the moment was right. She never found the right moment. Standing in that kitchen, listening through the wall, she was almost glad. "She'll be fine," he said in French to whoever was on the other end of the phone. Cassidy doesn't ask questions. That's always been her best quality. There was a pause, a laugh from him again. "She thinks I'm in a call with Singapore. She's probably asleep." Another pause. "The Vancouver property will transfer before the end of the month. After the Q3 filing, there'll be nothing left to find. We just need to keep things quiet a little longer." Cassidy set the glass down on the counter without making a sound. She walked back upstairs. She got into bed. She lay there in the dark listening to the hum of the city outside. They lived in a high-rise in downtown Calgary, 29th floor, the kind of view that made people say you must feel so lucky. And she thought very carefully about what she had just heard. She didn't cry. That surprised her a little. She thought she would. Instead, she thought about the word transfer. She thought about what it meant in the context of assets. She thought about the Vancouver property, which was supposedly a rental investment they held jointly, and which she had never once seen a statement for. She thought about the Q3 filing and what exactly would need to be hidden before it and from whom, and she thought, "He doesn't know I understood a single word." That was when she decided not to say anything. Not yet. People who know Cassidy Fournier from the outside, from her LinkedIn, from the firm dinners, from the charity galas she attended in structured blazers and quiet earrings, would probably describe her as composed, measured. The kind of woman who doesn't raise her voice because she doesn't need to. What they don't know is that composure, for Cassidy, was never a personality trait. It was a survival skill she developed at 14, when her parents' restaurant in Richmond Hill went under and her family spent 8 months in her aunt's basement, while her mother worked double shifts and her father looked for contracting work. You learn very quickly in those months that panic is expensive, that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the one making the most useful decisions. She was 28 when she met Garrison Whitmore at a fundraiser in Toronto. He was 39. He'd built a real estate development firm from a single leveraged property in Edmonton to a portfolio worth, depending on which article you read, somewhere between 40 and 60 million. He was the kind of man who made a room feel like it was organized around him without seeming to try. Cassidy had met men like that before and found them exhausting. Garrison was different, or seemed different, which is perhaps the most dangerous kind. He asked for her card. She gave it. He called 3 days later, which was, she noticed, exactly long enough to seem unhurried but short enough to mean something. They were married 14 months after that. The wedding was small, her mother cried. His family flew in from Quebec and seemed to approve, or at least tolerated the notion of a daughter-in-law, who was half Chinese and half Francophone from Sudbury. There were a few stiff hugs, a lot of good wine. Cassidy wore a dress she'd bought at a boutique on Queen Street and altered herself because she'd always been good with her hands. She was happy. She wants to be clear about that, even now. She was genuinely happy for a while. The doubts came slowly and then all at once, which is how most doubts arrive if you're honest with yourself. A business trip extended by 4 days with very little explanation. A second phone she spotted once and was told was for work calls, then never saw again. Dinners that ran until midnight. A weekend in Whistler he took alone, supposedly with clients, where she later noticed the hotel charges didn't match the dates he'd given her. Each of these things, in isolation, she could explain. She was good at explaining things away. She'd spent her whole adult life being reasonable, being the one who didn't assume the worst, being the woman who gave people the benefit of the doubt, because she understood that life was complicated and people were fallible, and relationships required grace. She told herself she was being gracious. What she was actually being, she understands now, was convenient. After the night in the kitchen, Cassidy did not confront Garrison. She did not go cold or distant or brittle in the ways that might tip him off. She made his coffee in the morning. She asked about his meetings. She said have a good day when he left, and she meant it to sound the way it always had, and apparently it did. Because he never looked at her any differently. What she did instead was start paying attention in a way she hadn't before. She pulled out the joint tax filings from the last 3 years and read them properly for the first time. She'd always left that to Garrison's accountant. A man named Leonard she'd met maybe twice, who sent documents to her email with sticky flags on the signature lines and a note that said please sign and return. She'd signed and returned, without reading. She read now. There were things in those returns that didn't add up, or rather, they added up perfectly, too perfectly, in a way that suggested someone had worked very hard to make them seem clean. Properties she didn't recognize. Numbered companies. A holding trust in Alberta that she was listed as a co-director of and had never once been consulted about. She photographed everything. She was methodical about it. She didn't rush. She didn't tell anyone, not her mother, not her closest friend Priya, not her sister in Vancouver. She understood instinctively that the value of what she knew was entirely dependent on her not appearing to know it. The moment Garrison suspected she was looking, options would close. Money would move. Documents would be amended. She thought about the word transfer a lot in those weeks. She called a law firm in Toronto, not in Calgary, not anywhere Garrison had connections, and made an appointment using her personal email and her credit card from before the marriage, the one she'd never closed and rarely used. She spoke to a family lawyer named Okonkwo, who specialized in high-net-worth separations, and came recommended by a woman Cassidy had met exactly once at a conference in Halifax. She remembered the woman, a tax litigator, sharp and direct, who had pressed a card into her hand at the end of a panel discussion and said, if you ever need this, use it. Cassidy had kept the card in the back of her planner for 2 years, telling herself it was just in case. She had always known, she thinks, somewhere she didn't want to look. Okonkwo was direct. She laid out the situation over 2 video calls, sharing her screen to walk through the documents she'd compiled. Okonkwo listened without interrupting. When Cassidy finished, the lawyer said, the holding trust is the key. If he's moving assets into that trust before a divorce filing, that's potentially fraudulent conveyance. But we need to establish the timeline. When did you say you heard this conversation? 6 weeks ago. And the Vancouver property. Do you know who the other party on the call was? No. But I know the transfer was supposed to happen before the end of the month. That was 6 weeks ago, so if it happened, it's done. Okonkwo nodded. Then we request the records. If the transfer happened, we can challenge it. But Cassidy, she paused, looked directly into the camera. How are you doing with all of this? It was such a simple question. Cassidy had been asked it 100 times in her life and deflected it 100 times without thinking. This time she said, I'm angry, but I think I've been angry for a long time and just didn't let myself feel it. Okonkwo said, good. Angry is useful. Angry means you're paying attention. The thing about a man who doesn't think his wife is paying attention is that he gets careless. Garrison had always been careful in the ways that mattered to him. His public image, his firm's reputation, his relationships with investors and city councilors, and the kind of people who attended the right dinners. He was meticulous about those things, but inside the house, with Cassidy, he had grown comfortable in the way that people grow comfortable when they've decided someone isn't a threat. He started taking calls in the living room instead of his office. He left his laptop open. He forgot sometimes to lower his voice. Cassidy noticed all of it. She said nothing. She filed it away. She learned, over those weeks, more about Garrison's business than she had in 3 years of marriage. She learned that the Vancouver property had transferred. She confirmed this through a land title search she ran herself, online, $10.15, into a numbered company that she was not listed in. She learned that there were 2 other properties she hadn't known existed. One in Palm Springs, one in a suburb of Phoenix. She learned that Garrison had been in a relationship, or something resembling one, with a woman named Tasha, who worked at a development consultancy in Edmonton, and who had been on at least 3 of the trips Cassidy had been told were client events. She didn't find this last piece of information through surveillance or subterfuge. She found it because Tasha, apparently unaware that Garrison's wife existed as anything other than an abstract inconvenience, had tagged him in an Instagram post from a restaurant in Banff that Cassidy had always wanted to go to. Garrison had taken the post down within an hour. Cassidy had taken a screenshot within 4 minutes. She wasn't even particularly hurt by this revelation, which surprised her. Or rather, she was hurt, but it was a distant, clarifying kind of hurt, the kind that cuts through fog instead of creating it. It confirmed something she'd been circling around for months without wanting to name it. Garrison had not simply grown distant or preoccupied. He had made a series of choices, sustained over time, in which she did not factor as someone who mattered. That was the thing that actually hurt. Not Tasha. Not the money. The fact that she had been, all along, someone he assumed would just stay in place. She thought about what he'd said on the phone. She doesn't ask questions. That's always been her best quality. She let herself be angry about that one properly for about 20 minutes. Then she put it somewhere useful. Okonkwo filed for divorce on a Tuesday in early October, while Garrison was at a site visit in Red Deer. Cassidy was at a coffee shop on 17th Avenue when her phone showed the confirmation email. She ordered a second cortado and sat with it for a moment, looking out at the street. It was one of those perfect Calgary autumn days where the sky is so blue it seems theatrical. The Rockies faint on the western edge of the city. She thought, he is going to be so certain he can manage this. She was right. He called her 20 minutes after he was served, and his voice was controlled and almost gentle, which she recognized as his negotiating register. The one he used when he needed someone to feel calm while he established the terms. "Cass," he said, "I think we should talk before this goes anywhere." "I agree," she said. "My lawyer will be in touch." A pause. "I think we can handle this between us. It doesn't need to be complicated." "I'm sure you do," she said. And she hung up. She had spent 3 years being the person who didn't let things be complicated. She had smoothed things over, translated tension into ease, absorbed friction so that rooms felt comfortable. She was extremely good at it and she was done doing it. The next 4 months were not simple. Garrison hired a lawyer in Calgary, a senior partner at a firm with a reputation for aggressive tactics in high-ass cases. And the process was at times exhausting in the particular way that legal proceedings are exhausting. Slow, technical, full of documents that needed to be read and responded to by a certain date, requiring a sustained attention to detail, that left no room for the kind of emotional processing that might have helped. Cassidy processed emotions on the weekends. She'd moved into a furnished apartment in Kensington. Nothing fancy, but it had a small balcony and good light in the morning. And she'd developed a habit of long Saturday walks along the river pathway, alone, sometimes all the way out to Edworthy Park and back, thinking through whatever needed thinking. Her mother called twice a week. Her friend Priya flew in from Toronto for a long weekend in November and they cooked dinner and watched bad television and didn't talk about Garrison much, which was exactly what Cassidy needed. She was okay, in the main. Not performing okay. Actually okay, most of the time, in the way that people sometimes are when the thing they'd been afraid of has already happened and there's nothing left to dread. The case centered on the holding trust and the transferred properties. Okonkwo had been right that the Vancouver transfer was the key. The timing, finalized 3 weeks after Garrison had said, on the phone, that it would happen before the Q3 filing, established a clear pattern of intent to reduce the marital's estate before separation. The Phoenix and Palm Springs properties, purchased through a US-based LLC that Garrison had not disclosed in any filing, were arguably matrimonial assets under Alberta law depending on how the court interpreted their acquisition dates. Garrison's lawyer argued that the trust had been established well before any marital difficulties, and that the foreign properties were premarital investments. Okonkwo picked both arguments apart with the patience of someone who had done exactly this many times and found it straightforward. There was one afternoon in a mediation session in a boardroom, on the 40th floor of a glass tower downtown. When Garrison looked across the table at Cassidy, and she could see him trying to calculate exactly when she had become someone who knew all of this, his eyes moved between her and Okonkwo and the documents laid out on the table, and for just a moment his composure slipped. Not dramatically, not in any way anyone else in the room would have caught, but she knew his face. She knew when he'd realized she had understood the phone call. He looked at her, and she could see him running the timeline, and she could see the specific moment the timeline assembled itself into something he didn't have a strategy for. She held his gaze. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The settlement was reached in February. Cassidy is not going to specify the numbers here because they're no one else's business. But Okonkwo called it one of the most comprehensive resolutions she'd seen from a case of this size. And Cassidy is inclined to believe her. The Vancouver property came back. A portion of the trust assets was attributed to the marital estate. The Phoenix and Palm Springs properties were addressed in a separate negotiated agreement. She walked out of the lawyer's office on a gray Wednesday afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing cold air. The city sounded like it always does. Traffic, construction somewhere in the distance, a transit train passing on the elevated track above 7th Avenue. She called her mother. "It's done," she said. Her mother said, "Good, come home for the weekend. I'll make congee." Cassidy laughed properly for the first time in months. "Yes," she said, "okay." She has thought a lot since then about the night in the kitchen, about standing at the counter in the dark, hearing her husband's voice change registers into the language he thought was private, the language she had spent 3 quiet years learning. Because she loved him and wanted to understand him fully, she thinks about how different it would have gone if she'd spoken up right then. If she'd walked into that room and said I understood every word, she thinks about the scramble that would have followed. The apologies, the deflections, the managed version of events he would have assembled so quickly, because he was very good at that. She thinks about the leverage she would have handed him by showing her hand too soon. She kept quiet, and she paid attention, and she did her research, and she built a case so thorough that there was almost nothing to fight over. Her mother used to say, when Cassidy was small and impatient, the fruit doesn't fall until it's ready. It was the kind of thing that sounds like a cliché until you're standing in a lawyer's office in February, holding a settlement agreement that accounts for every asset a man tried to move out of your reach. And then it sounds like the most useful piece of advice you ever received. Garrison never apologized. She doesn't expect he will. She thinks about Tasha sometimes, briefly, wonders if she knew about the marriage, wonders if she's still in Garrison's life, wonders if it matters. It mostly doesn't, which she takes as a sign of something good. She doesn't wish Tasha any particular harm. She doesn't wish Garrison any particular harm either. She wishes him very little at all, which feels like the healthiest possible outcome. Her apartment in Kensington is still hers. She renewed the lease in March and bought a proper couch, a plant she's managed not to kill, a French press that she uses every morning and finds disproportionately satisfying. She still speaks French. She speaks it better now, actually. She's been taking a conversation class on Tuesday evenings at the Alliance Française, near downtown, a small group, mostly retirees and some university students, and the instructor compliments her accent. She doesn't know what she'll do with it. It doesn't need to be for anything. She knows who she is in a way she wasn't sure about before. Not because the divorce made her stronger, she dislikes that framing, but because the months of paying attention, of being methodical and quiet and thorough, reminded her of things about herself she'd let go soft. She is someone who pays attention. She is someone who doesn't show her hand until the moment is exactly right. She is someone who spent 3 years learning her husband's secret language, and in the end, the secret it revealed was not his. It was hers.